Greetings, history geeks! Today we're exploring a chapter of the Revolutionary War that's as complex as it is tragic. The attack on New London and the Battle of Fort Griswold. This isn't just a story of Patriots versus Redcoats. It's a story of Americans fighting Americans with Loyalists and Patriots fighting alongside British troops. A reminder that the Revolutionary War was in some ways a civil war. Picture this: Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief, orders an operation to cripple the rebellious colonies. The target? New London, a vital hub for American privateers. And leading the charge? Benedict Arnold, once a Patriot hero, now a traitor commanding British forces. The center of this operation is the HMS Hannah, a captured British prize ship, burned and sent adrift like a Viking funeral ship. It became a fury warning and symbol of the destruction to come. In this video, we'll uncover the attack on New London, where homes, warehouses, and ships were engulfed in flames, and witness the fierce Battle of Fort Griswold, where 150 Patriots faced a devastating assault, outnumbered but unbroken in their resolve. So join me as we unravel the story of the HMS Hannah, the attack on New London, and the Battle of Fort Griswold. A chapter in history that reminds us freedom's cost is steep and its legacy is complicated. But before we jump into the heat of battle, let's get to know the main character of this story, Matthew Griswold. And yes, the name Griswold might ring a bell. Perhaps you're thinking of Clark Griswold from the National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. But unlike Clark's comedic antics, Matthew Griswold's story is one of real historical drama, as he caused plenty of trouble for the British during the Revolutionary War. So let's begin by learning about the Griswold family and their fascinating history. The Griswold story begins in England, where the patriarch of this family dynasty is born. Edward Griswold was born on January 26, 1607 in Kenilworth, Warwickshire, England, near Solihull. Interestingly, landmarks tied to the Griswold family can still be found in that region today. Edward made a bold move in 1630, boarding the Mary and John with the Reverend Hewitt to start a new life in the American colonies. He initially settled in Dorchester, Massachusetts, before moving to Windsor, Connecticut in 1639. Edward played a key role in colonial affairs as an agent for St. Nicholas of Knoll, Warwickshire, negotiating with the British officials on behalf of the colonies. He passed away in 1690, leaving behind a legacy that would shape one of Connecticut's most prominent families. So, this brings us to Matthew Griswold, a descendant of Edward who continued the family's tradition of prominence and public service. Born on March 25, 1714, Matthew was a skilled lawyer, admitted to the New London Bar in 1742. He later became the King's Attorney, a powerful position representing the Crown in Connecticut legal affairs. Despite his royal appointment, Griswold was a staunch opponent of the Stamp Act, joining the Sons of Liberty in defying its enforcement. His legal expertise and leadership solidified his legacy as a pivotal figure in Connecticut's pre-Revolutionary War history. The Revolutionary War broke out. Griswold wholeheartedly supported the colonist cause. In 1775, he was appointed to the Council of Safety, where he played a critical role on the committees dealing with troop movements, military appointments, provisions, and defense. However, it was the defense of Connecticut's shoreline that most concerned him. Living at Blackhall, near the mouth of the Connecticut River, Griswold saw firsthand the dangers posed by British ships. He helped fend off a British attack on Lyme and even thwarted raids on his own home, Blackhall, and nearby farms. His efforts led to the successful petitioning of Governor Trumbull to station troops in Lyme. Griswold's influence didn't stop there. Using his position and resources, he played a significant role in the creation of Groton Fort, later renamed Fort Griswold in his honor. Fort, petitioned to be built around December 5, 1775, became a key defensive structure for the region. Once the war started, Griswold's dual roles as deputy governor and a military advisor made him a prime target for British authorities. Family lore tells of several close calls when British soldiers came hunting for him. On one occasion, he reportedly hid in a large chest covered with bags. while his wife, Ursula, distracted the soldiers as they searched the house. Another time, he evaded capture by hiding under a pile of linen spread on the lawn by his neighbor's daughter, Hetty Marvin. Even in his 60s, Griswold managed to outwit his pursuers, maintaining his vital contributions to the revolutionary cause. Once again, in May of 1780, as the Revolutionary War edged toward its conclusion, British authorities made one last desperate attempt to capture Matthew Griswold. This time, it was the Royal Navy that took a swing at abducting him. Griswold himself wrote about the incident in a letter preserved in the National Archives. In this letter to a fellow patriot, he recounts the harrowing experience. This certifies that some months past, intelligence was sent to the house of Mr. Lubzander from Long Island of a conspiracy by some of the officers of the British Navy then in Gordon Bay, with some others to take me a prisoner and carry me to the enemy. This intelligence, I understand, was sent in diverse ways by Mr. David Gardner of Southold on Long Island, since which time I have seen Mr. Gardner at Hartford, who gave me some information, all as I took it as a friendly caution to avoid the threatened mischief. The British plan, however, was a complete failure, thanks to timely intelligence and the vigilance of Griswold and his allies. But the drama doesn't end here. It's only just beginning. Let's fast forward 4 months later through the fall of 1780 and shift our focus to the strategic importance of Fort Griswold. During the Revolutionary War, Fort Griswold stood as the primary defender of the port of New London, Connecticut. This port was a vital supply center for the Continental Army and served as a haven for the Connecticut-sanctioned privateers. These privateers, essentially legal pirates, had one mission: to disrupt British shipping. Licensed by the state of Connecticut and operating under rules set by Congress, these privateers grew bolder with each passing year, capturing more and more British vessels. Their most notable victory came with the capture of the HMS Hannah. The ship carried a rich cargo of personal supplies meant for British officers stationed in New York City. This stunning success not only disrupted British morale, but also set the stage for the dramatic events that were about to unfold. On September 6, 1781, General Sir Henry Clinton devised a devastating plan to crush New London, Connecticut, infamously nicknamed the Den of the Serpents, for its aggressive privateering against British ships. To execute the mission, Clinton dispatched none other than General Benedict Arnold, the notorious American traitor. Arnold's goal? Retaliate for the capture of the HMS Hannah and put an end to the rebels' privateering stronghold. Arnold wasn't alone. The British also sent a massive flotilla of 32 ships led by British Admiral Thomas Graves, with transport boats carrying troops to storm the shores of New London. But there was a critical oversight. Admiral Graves anchored his fleet off Long Island the night before, waiting for the flotilla to gather. By morning, with over 32 ships assembled and only 10 miles from New London, the fleet somehow went unnoticed. As the British fleet moved up the Long Island Sound, Colonel William Leonard, the commander of the American forces in the region, was busy making his rounds, inspecting the readiness of forts on both sides of the Thames River. Historians suggest a shocking reason for this oversight. Either the Sea Coast Guards were asleep on duty, or worse, they simply weren't present. According to Francis Manwaring Calkins, a renowned historian of New London County, it's believed that the constant sounding of false alarms during the war had caused the local militia to grow complacent. Adding to the intrigue, there is a strong belief that Elijah Beckworth, a resident of Lyme's Second Society and a known Tory, provided intelligence to the British. Beckworth is thought to have supplied not only detailed plans of New London's town layout, but also the defenses in place, helping British commanders fine-tune their attack strategy. By 9 a.m., the British fleet reached the mouth of the Thames River. Within an hour, the first transport boats landed on the New London side, about 3 miles from the town center. As the British moved inland, Fort Griswold sounded the alarm. The distress signal, a sequence of 2 cannon shots fired at fixed intervals, was meant to summon reinforcements from the surrounding countryside. But, in a sinister twist, the British fleet had intercepted this signal. One of their largest ships fired a 3rd cannon shot, changing the signal's meaning. This clever stratagem created confusion, leading local militia to believe the signal announced a victory or a prize rather than a call for reinforcements. This cunning move delayed or in some cases completely prevented the arrival of reinforcements, leaving New London dangerously exposed to the coming assault. At around 9 a.m. on September 6, 1781, Benedict Arnold's troops began landing along the New London side of the Thames River. Arnold personally led half of his army with the mission to destroy the warehouses and any ships in port. Meanwhile, the other half of the British forces, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Eyre, landed on the Groton side. Their objective, attack Fort Griswold, the stronghold that was perched on Groton Heights. Arnold's force was a mix of battle-hardened troops, including the 38th Regulars, the American Legion, loyal Americans, refugees, and about 60 Hessian troops, totaling approximately 800 men. These troops came prepared, bringing along cannons and supplies. Benedict Arnold himself was no stranger to New London. Born in Norwich, Connecticut, just a 35-minute drive away by today's standards, Arnold was once a celebrated hero of the American cause. But by this point, his name was synonymous with treason after his infamous attempt to hand over West Point to the British just a year earlier. As Arnold's men unloaded their cannons and prepared for their assault, sporadic resistance from local militia, likely homeowners defending their properties, erupted. While not as fierce as the opening volleys at Lexington and Concord, this resistance was enough to sow chaos. In his report to Sir Henry Clinton, dated September 8, 1781, Arnold noted how the sound of the musket fire awakened the townspeople. Amid the musket fire, panic spread across New London. Families hastily packed their belongings and fled to the northern parish, while local militia units and off-duty Continental soldiers began to rise in defense of their town. By 11 a.m., Arnold's forces had advanced to within 700 yards of Fort Trumbull, only to encounter heavy fire from a small redoubt positioned on a rise to their left, known as Fort Nonsense. This unexpected resistance forced Arnold to act. He dispatched 4 companies of his elite 38 regulars under the command of Captain Millet to neutralize the threat. The defenders of Fort Nonsense had fired on Arnold's troops for some time, but finally dispersed as Captain Millet's forces closed in. At the redoubt, Arnold's men seized 4 mounted cannons and 2 unmounted ones, effectively silencing the resistance. Arnold was reportedly pleased to have snuffed out this hot fire of resistance. Captain Millet was soon joined by a company of the American Legion under Captain Frink, and together they pressed forward toward Fort Trumbull. However, Fort Trumbull was incomplete at the time and offered no effective defense against a land assault. With Fort Nonsense subdued and Fort Trumbull vulnerable, Arnold's men had secured a critical foothold in their campaign against New London. This was only the beginning of the destruction to come. At Fort Trumbull, Captain Adam Shapley, a respected military leader and veteran of key battles like White Plains and Long Island, was tasked with defending the fort. A New London native, Shapley lived just a short walk from the fort. His force consisted of 23 militia members and off-duty Continentals, a small but determined group. Earlier that morning, Shapley had met with Colonel Ledard and received his orders. Fire a defiant shot, spike the cannons to prevent their use by the enemy, and retreat across the river to reinforce Fort Griswold in Groton. As British captains Millet and Frink approached Fort Trumbull, their soldiers marched in tight rows along a road closer to the riverbank. Once they were within range, Shapley's defenders fired a shot of grape shot, causing 5 casualties among the British troops. Following their orders, Shapley's men quickly spiked the cannons and fled to the rowboats stationed near the eastern side of the fort. As the British overran the fort, the defenders scrambled across the Thames River to regroup at Fort Griswold. Meanwhile, Arnold's forces continued advancing toward New London's waterfront. Under his command, 1 company was left to secure Fort Trumbull, while another held the redoubt captured earlier. The rest of the British forces moved swiftly to join Arnold in his march toward the town. As the defenders fled across the Thames, British ships in the river opened fire on the rowboats, taking prisoners and inflicting casualties. Despite the danger, Captain Shapley and several of his men made it safely to the other side, unaware that 800 additional British troops had landed on the Groton side near Avery Point. Approaching New London, Arnold paused to survey the town. Sporadic musket fire from independent militia slowed his advance, but wasn't enough to stop him. With 60 Hessian soldiers and 100 New Jersey Loyalists leading the way, Arnold pushed forward. As Arnold's forces neared the intersection of the Town Hill Road and the bank, they encountered another line of resistance. On a hill to their left, a lone field cannon, a 6-pounder, usually reserved for celebrations, was manned by just 4 resolute citizens. Following the initial resistance, Benedict Arnold ordered a detachment to advance up Blackhall Street, a side road off the bank. The defenders, facing overwhelming odds, fled the position. However, as the British detachment moved into the area, they came under random and increasing fire from local militia, hiding behind stone walls and trees. As Arnold's main force advanced along the bank, they encountered more resistance. According to Lieutenant Colonel Upham, commander of the New Jersey Loyalists, the march into New London was fraught with constant skirmishing. In his letter to Governor Franklin, he recounted, "We proceeded to the town in New London, constantly skirmishing with rebels, who fled from hill to hill and stone fences which intersected the country at small distances. Having reached the southerly part of the town, the general requested me to take possession of the hill north of the meeting house, where the rebels had collected and which they seemed resolved to hold." With his forces firmly established in New London, Benedict Arnold turned his attention to the destruction of the town's resources. His men began by setting fire to the warehouses along the waterfront, destroying critical supplies and privateer equipment stored there. This is where the story takes a dramatic and almost mythic turn, evoking the tragedy of a Greek epic. One of the most dramatic moments was the burning of the HMS Hannah, a British prize ship captured earlier that summer by New London privateers. Originally, Arnold's forces may have planned to refit the ship and return it to Sir Henry Clinton, but their disgust and rage led them to set the vessel ablaze instead. In a scene reminiscent of a Viking funeral, the Hannah was engulfed in flames, her hull blazing as she drifted down the river toward Winthrop Cove. Fire consumed her to the waterline. The once proud ship slowly sank, leaving behind a plume of black smoke. Arnold's troops didn't stop there. They targeted the homes of patriots who had supported New London's privateers, including General Gurdon Saltonstall's estate and other significant properties. By the time the fires were extinguished, much of New London lay in ruins, reduced to ash and rubble. While Upham's men provided covering fire, Arnold's forces advanced slowly along Hempstead Street, continuing their methodical destruction of New London. As Arnold moved forward, he reached a high point near the ancient cemetery, providing an excellent view of Groton Bank and the fort across the river. From this vantage point, Arnold saw that Fort Griswold was well defended, and a frontal assault would likely result in a disaster akin to Bunker Hill. Deciding against further attacks, Arnold gave orders to stop the assault on Fort Griswold. But it was already too late. The battle for Fort Griswold had already begun. As the British troops commanded by Colonel Eyre arrived at the fort, they moved swiftly into strategic positions. Eyre deployed his forces on multiple fronts, a main assault to the southern-eastern sides, while a smaller diversionary detachment moved toward the western side. A maneuver everyone understood to be a suicide mission. Inside the fort, American Colonel William Ledyard counted about 150 defenders, a mix of militia, volunteers, a few off-duty Continentals, and even some Stonington men on their way home from guard duty at Saybrook Fort. Despite their small numbers and the fort's poor condition, Ledyard and his officers convened a council of war. Their plan: hold out long enough for the militia, alerted by the alarm signals, to come to their aid. At 12 o'clock, British Captain Beckworth approached the fort under a flag of truce to deliver an ultimatum: unconditional surrender. Colonel Eyre's forces had taken attack positions ready to storm the fort if necessary. Ledyard, refusing to give in, sent Captains Elijah Avery, Amos Stanton, and John Williams to meet the British and deliver their reply. After a tense exchange, the Americans rejected the demand for surrender. Eyre responded with a grim warning: if forced to storm the fort, the British would enforce martial law, giving no quarter to the defenders. The reply from the Americans was resolute: Captain Adam Shapley of New London, who had just arrived to reinforce the defenders, delivered the defiant response: "We shall not surrender the fort, let the consequences be what they were." This bold declaration would echo through history, symbolizing the determination and courage of the defenders at Fort Griswold, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the British forces approached Fort Griswold, dozens, if not hundreds, of militia from Groton responded to the alarm. These men began forming to defend the fort, but the sight of heavily armed British regiments, supported by the intimidating Hessian soldiers with their gleaming bayonets, caused hesitation. Many militia members chose to stay hidden in the forest, unwilling to face near certain death. Some begged Captain Stanton to abandon the fort and instead adopt a guerrilla-style campaign, hiding from behind trees, stone walls, and barns. Others urged him to draw the defenders out of the fort to meet the British on open ground, where they might stand a chance of being treated as prisoners under the laws of war. But inside the fort, surrender meant slaughter. Faced with such grim odds, many militia members, including Colonel Gallup and his men, remained in the woods, waiting to see the outcome of what they believed to be a hopeless defense. Among the few who stepped forward was Naval Captain Elias Halsey, an experienced cannoneer. Halsey took charge of the fort's main cannon, determined to stand his ground. As Colonel Eyre's forces began their advance, a small party of 12 American defenders fired a single volley from the eastern battery, then fell back to the fort's walls. The opening shot signaled the start of the Battle of Fort Griswold. Inside the fort, Colonel Leadard gave a crucial order: fire until the enemy reached a point where their losses would be devastating. As the British detachment approached, Captain Halsey fired the lone 18-pounder cannon, its barrel loaded with deadly grape shot. Cannon's discharge tore through the British ranks, killing 20 men instantly and leaving others writhing in agony, some missing limbs. The blast created a gaping hole in the British line, but it was quickly filled with more soldiers, a testament to their discipline and determination. The chaos, the British maintained an odd sense of order, even as wounded soldiers dragged themselves from the field. The once quiet ground around the fort became a sea of scarlet uniforms as the British closed in on the southwest bastion under a hail of gunfire from the defenders. Amid the carnage, British officers shouted commands, urging their men forward despite the relentless fire from the fort. It was here on the southern approach that Colonel Eyre himself was struck by a musket ball and mortally wounded. Eyre was carried from the field, just one of many victims of the day's bloodshed. With Eyre incapacitated, British officer Major Montgomery took command. He organized his men into a solid column formation and directed them toward the northern and eastern sides of the fort. Montgomery's forces advanced under heavy fire, their ranks thinning as casualties mounted. Despite suffering devastating losses, Montgomery threw his entire force at the eastern side, determined to break through. The defenders of Fort Griswold, vastly outnumbered but resolute, continued their desperate fight against overwhelming odds. As the British pressed their assault, Major Montgomery led his troops to the eastern redoubt, abandoned by the defenders. From there they surged onto the fort's walls, establishing lodgements on the ramparts. Despite being overwhelmed, the defenders mounted an incredible resistance, pouring a relentless hail of cannon fire, rockets, and musket balls on the advancing British soldiers. Scarlet-clad soldiers of the 40th Regiment pushed forward, scaling the 12-foot-high pickets, only to be cut down. But they kept coming. As the British finally breached the walls, Major Montgomery himself climbed to the top, where he was met by Jordan Freeman. Freeman, wielding a long pike, struck Montgomery down, killing him instantly. Enraged by the death of their commander, the British soldiers surged forward with renewed furiosity. Soaring over the walls and embrasures, they pressed into the fort. Amid the confusion, the fort's main flag was shot from its stand. Mistaking this as a sign of surrender, the British rushed toward the main gate, but the defenders had one last trick in store. As the regulars approached, the Americans unleashed a devastating volley of fire and cannon, cutting many down. But the British pressed on. One soldier attempted to open the gate but was killed instantly by a musket ball to the head. Others followed, and despite heavy fire, they succeeded in opening the gate. Inside the fort, Colonel Leadard, the American commander, realized the situation was hopeless. With no reinforcements coming and surrounded by chaos, he ordered his men to cease resistance and throw down their arms. The defenders complied, laying down their weapons, but the rage of the British regulars could not be contained. On the southwest side of the fort, unaware of the surrender, defenders continued to resist. British troops, now in control of a cannon on the north side, turned it on the Americans, firing 2 volleys that killed Captain Shapley and Lieutenant Chapman. Those who survived quickly threw down their weapons and pleaded for mercy. British soldiers entered the fort. Chaos descended. Forming into platoons, they began firing on and bayoneting defenders who tried to hide in the officers' quarters, barracks, and magazine areas. It was then that Major Bromfield, the highest-ranking British officer left standing, demanded, "Who commands this fort?" Stepping forward, Colonel Ledard, sword in hand, responded with honor, "I did, sir, but you do now." Lowering his sword to signify surrender, Ledard's act should have ended the violence. But enraged and humiliated by the heavy losses, Bromfield lunged forward, stabbing Ledard through the heart. Ledard fell where he stood, and with his death, the massacre began. Others near Ledard, including Captain Peter Richards and Ledard's nephew, Young's Ledard, rushed forward to protect him. Gravely injured but still standing, Richards held Ledard as they were both cut down, along with anyone else in the vicinity. Fort Griswold, once a symbol of defiance, had become the site of one of the Revolutionary War's most tragic massacres. The massacre raged within Fort Griswold. One British commander, overwhelmed by the carnage, demanded an end to the slaughter. His desperate cries echoed across the battlefield. "Stop! Stop! In the name of heaven, I say stop! My soul cannot bear it!" The aftermath of the battle was grim. Major Montgomery and other fallen British officers were buried at the front of the fort, near where they fell. Wounded Americans were hastily gathered and loaded onto carts bound for the waterfront. Those deemed mortally wounded, numbering about 35, were paroled and left behind outside the fort to succumb to their injuries. Another 30 non-fatal wounded were marched to the riverbank to be imprisoned aboard British ships bound for New York. The Battle of Fort Griswold had ended. The countryside, once vibrant with life, now lay silent, gray with ash, and blackened by the absence of light. It was a battle that would resonate for generations. Before we close, I wanted to share a personal connection to this story. My husband and I visited Fort Griswold in 2021, and walking those historic grounds was an unforgettable experience. We even recorded some video of the fort, which I'd like to share with you now. Standing where the events unfolded was humbling. You can almost feel the history come alive. The bravery of the defenders, the ferocity of the battle, and the weight of the sacrifices made here. It's one thing to read about it, but seeing it in person connects you to the past in such a powerful way. Fort Griswold is more than a historical site. It's a testament to the resilience and determination of those who fought for freedom. If you ever have the opportunity to visit, I highly recommend it. It's a place where history truly comes to life. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more historical stories like this. Don't forget to ring the bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload future videos.